It was a Tuesday morning in August 2004 when I arrived at the gates of Buckingham Palace. Tony, Posh's dad, met me at the gates, which was unusual. He normally opened them by remote control when I arrived each morning. "Hi Steve," he said, leaning over my car change of plan. "I've got a meeting at 11 o'clock that I don't want to cancel. So can you pick up Victoria? Her plane comes in at Heathrow at 10:40. "No problem," I said, and I began reversing my car. "Oh Steve," said Tony, producing a bunch of keys. "Take the BMW." Having worked for the Beckhams for a full 6 months, I was used to these last-minute change of plans. Officially I was employed by Tony Adams, Posh's dad. He was my boss. He decided my work rota, my schedule for the week, yet somehow, in my mind, I always felt that I was really working for Posh Spice. After all, she held the purse strings. She had the final say. I couldn't help feeling that Tony, in a way, was an employee too, employed by his famous daughter Posh Spice. Tony was a successful businessman in his own right and I respected him for that, but since the advent of the Spice Girls and their phenomenal success, he found himself more and more looking after Buckingham Palace, supervising the building work and seeing to the security arrangements. Keeping up with Posh and Bex was a full-time job, and whenever Posh needed help she always turned to her dear old dad. I suppose, in the end, I was there to help Tony cope with the pressure. I was young, fit and able to turn my hand to any task, whether that was driving, building walls and fences, or a trip to Tesco to stock up the Buckingham Palace deep freeze. I was on call 24 hours a day, and it was nothing to get a bell from Tony on Sunday afternoon asking me to come over and help him out with something or other. Living just 3 miles from Buckingham Palace, that was no problem. It was all part of the job. On that Tuesday morning the weather was fine and sunny. I drove with the window down. I looked out across fields of wheat as I drove along the motorway. The countryside looked so peaceful and inviting. I saw a river with cows grazing in the water meadows. I saw woodlands and green fields. It was a perfect summer's day. I was in a good mood, and why shouldn't I be? I was going to Heathrow to pick up Posh Spice, one of the sexiest ladies on the planet and a member of the world-famous Spice Girls. I felt relaxed. I'd met Posh before. The last time was in October 2003 when I went over to Spain to help them house hunting. David had left Manchester United, some say under a cloud, and joined Real Madrid. I went over mainly to drive Victoria and her mum to view some properties and generally to be a helping hand. I suppose I was their driver and bodyguard back then. I know Tony was glad that I was in Spain accompanying his daughter and his ex-wife, Jackie. It gave him peace of mind that I was there, and he phoned quite often for a chat to see how things were going. For me, that trip to Spain was like being on holiday, and with all the driving around I was learning the layout of Madrid at the same time. Alice, my pleasant drive to Heathrow on that sunny August morning suddenly came to an abrupt halt. A lorry had jackknifed across all 3 lanes of the motorway. Everything came to a standstill. I knew that the plane from Madrid touched down at 10:40 a.m. that morning. Alice, there was nothing I could do but sit and wait. The police eventually cleared a motorway and I finally arrived at the airport at 12 noon. I found Posh in the VIP lounge reclining in a comfortable chair and reading a magazine. She looked relaxed and quite unconcerned. However, when she saw me she pointed at her watch. "Stephen, I've been here since 10:45, she said. "I'm sorry," I said. "But don't you worry," smiled Posh. "Dad's been on the mobile and told me all about a motorway hold-up." She beckoned me over. "Come and sit down," she said. I sat down and we chatted for a while, there in the VIP lounge. While we chatted, I had a chance to take a good look at Posh. She was wearing a black, pleated skirt, a cream blouse with long cuffs, nylon stockings and ankle-length high-heeled boots. Her hair was silky and quite short. There was end-to-hair extension inside. She looked smart and businesslike. I could easily have mistaken her for one of the air hostesses at Heathrow who were also dressed in a smart, businesslike fashion. Our little chat over, Posh stood up and put her Gucci bag over her shoulder. We took a suitcase each and rolled them through the lounge and out to the car. As we were approaching the car, a couple of photographers suddenly appeared from nowhere and began taking snaps. I thought it was quite funny, those guys flashing away while I lugged the suitcases into the boot. This is fame, I thought. These suitcases weigh a ton. I said, what's inside these things, Spanish gold? Posh just smiled at me and slammed down the car boot. Later, as Posh climbed into the front seat beside me, her black, pleated skirt rolled up, showing her thighs and even a glimpse of a suspender. She quickly smoothed her skirt forward and looked at me with a cheeky smile. I felt a frisson, a sudden charge of electricity. I think it was at that moment that I knew there was a sexual attraction between us. We had got on well together. Back in Spain, I'd enjoyed being around Posh and her mom, listening to their mother-daughter banter, and even the odd argument. Posh and her mom were two strong-willed women, both used to having their own way, so it was inevitable that a few sparks would fly. For all that I know, Posh was happy to have her mom around. Jackie was her best friend, and she valued her opinion. Driving back to Buckingham Palace, everything felt different. For one thing, we were alone together for the first time. We were both young people. I was just 2 years older than Posh, so it was hardly surprising that we would find each other sexually attractive. At least that was the case for me. Posh was turning me on with every passing minute. Victoria was over in England for a week's stay. She'd come to see her parents, her sister Louise and Louise's children. In a way, she had come home for a holiday, and I could sense that Posh was excited to revisit Buckingham Palace and meet up with her ma and pa once again. Inside those two heavy suitcases were presents for her family, purchased from high-class stores and shops in Madrid. We chatted as we drove along, and Posh told me a few things about her life in the Spanish capital and her adventures in that wonderful city. Everything feels so different over there, she said. It's hotter for one thing, there's a lot more sunshine. She is right. Madrid is different. It's the capital of Spain, and yet it's situated right in the center of the country. It's landlocked, whereas London is on a river, not far from the sea. It's a different world, I said, a different culture. The sun was shining down on the green acres of England as we drove along with the windows down. We passed an old church and village set amidst yellow fields of wheat. We saw a sports field with a game of cricket in progress. I could sense that Posh was glad to be back in England, back amidst the familiar scenes of her childhood. After all, there's no place like home. When we finally arrived at Buckingham Palace and the huge iron gates, like sesame, slowly opened up before us, I could sense Posh's excitement. There was even a tear in her eye. She couldn't wait to see her mother and father. She was also excited to see the progress of the building and decorating that had been going on at Buckingham in her absence. Posh had a great reception. Hugs and kisses from her father and mother, and a hot takeaway waiting in the kitchen. I felt privileged to be sitting there at the table with Posh and her parents, enjoying a meal of chicken korma and rice and listening to their conversation. The builders and other workers were relegated to the garden or their vans to eat their midday meal. How they must have envied me. Posh and her parents had a lot to catch up on. Of course they spoke most days on the phone, but there was nothing like talking face to face, heart to heart. It was important that Posh came over to England from time to time so she could make decisions on decoration, furniture and fabrics for Buckingham Palace. She could also take time out to sign important legal documents that needed her signature. Posh's sister Louise and her children arrived in the early afternoon, so, very soon, the Beckhams were one big, happy family. While this family reunion was going on, I went out to continue my work in the garden putting up a rose trellis. The blue skies and sunshine of the morning had given way to high cloud and it was becoming a hot, sultry afternoon. This was the English summer. This was August 2004 and it was proving to be a good year weather-wise, just like the summer of 2003, which was one of the best I've ever known. Around 3 o'clock I heard footsteps on the path behind me. I turned round and saw Posh walking towards me carrying a tray. On the tray was a jug of pineapple juice, loaded with ice cubes. "Fabulous," I said, taking the tray and putting it down on the grass. "That's just what I need." Posh put her hands on her waist and looked around at the rose garden. Many of the roses planted during the past 2 years were in bloom. "Wow," she said. "This garden is beginning to look fabulous. I wish David could see it right now." Over to the left was a wooden seat with a wooden trellis arching over it. Already pink, climbing roses were beginning to grow over the trellis. It would soon become a romantic rose arbor. Posh went over and sat down on the seat. It gave a wonderful view of the lawns and the flower beds with Buckingham Palace in the background. Said Posh. "I can just see David and me sitting here together when we're old and gray, talking about old times." Yes, I could see that too, and I tried to imagine the garden by then, 40 years on, no doubt flourishing with all the roses, trees and shrubs that had been planted in the past 2 years. The house would look different too by then, the bricks weathered and overgrown with Virginia creeper. Celebrity marriages are often fickle and don't last, of course, but somehow I got the feeling that David and Victoria's marriage was rock solid. Sadly, that wasn't the case with David and Victoria's parents. Both marriages had split up, causing much heartache to everyone. Victoria sat back on the wooden seat. She was wearing green shorts and a green t-shirt. Her slim legs, brown from the Spanish sun, her arms too. She looked lovely sitting there, like a Spanish Conchita. "I was wondering, Stephen," said Posh, turning to me and taking off her sunglasses, "would you drive me to London tomorrow? I want to do some shopping. Dad says it's okay." She added. "Sure," I said, smiling. "Your wish is my command." I felt that sudden frisson again, looking at Posh sitting there in those shorts, her lovely legs on display. I wondered if she was aware of the sexual chemistry between us. There was a silent pause as Posh took in the view of the garden and put her sunglasses back on. I just stood there, sipping my glass of ice-cool pineapple juice. "One other thing," said Posh at last. "While I'm here in England, I was thinking of having a break, a few days in the Lake District. I know you like the countryside, Stephen. Would you drive me there too?" As she said this, she took off her sunglasses again and looked at me with those big, brown eyes. I was a little surprised and taken aback by this request, but of course I said yes, not knowing what the arrangements were or even who was going on the trip. For instance, was Posh planning to take her sister Louise along or her mother Jackie? I didn't ask questions. I decided to play it by ear. Besides, I knew I would be getting paid for my time, and a drive up to the Lake District in the summertime could be nothing but fun and pleasure. Posh smiled at me from her romantic rose arbor. "That's settled then," she said. She stood up and I passed her the tray with the empty glass and jug. I watched as she walked off along the path on her way back to the house. "Wow," Just look at those legs, I thought. I could sense that Posh was in a good mood. She was at home, among her family. She could relax and enjoy her time in England and the fine summer weather. I carried on with my work on the rose trellis on that warm afternoon and thought back to my conversation with Posh. I thought about our forthcoming visit to the Lake District. In my mind's eye I saw her slim legs and her green shorts. Once again I saw her cute, pooky face smiling at me. Yes, she was pooky, I thought, as I stood there in the garden looking back at their house. Pooky, that would be my secret name for the lovely Posh spies. Chapter 2. Tuesday morning saw us cruising through St. John's Wood, past Lord's Cricket Ground, past Regent's Park, on our way to Oxford Street. Posh's father, Tony, had given me the BMW to drive, something he always did on important assignments, and nothing was more important than chaperoning his eldest daughter, Victoria. She was dressed quite casually that morning in tight dress, a blue jacket and a headscarf. She felt sure she could do some shopping, incognito, without being recognized, but if things began to get hot, I was on hand to effect a quick getaway. It was really quite crazy. After bringing those 2 heavy suitcases from Spain loaded with presents for Tony, her mother, and her sister Louise, she was now shopping for presents and treats for David and her 2 sons, to take back on the return journey. There were also some vital food items on her shopping list, things she couldn't get in Spain like HP sauce and OXO cubes. I dropped her off at Marks and Sparks in Oxford Street, then drove on to Hyde Park to pass an hour or 2, waiting for Posh's call on the mobile. I managed to get a parking space near Hyde Park and walked over to the Serpentine. There was hazy sunshine. It was a warm, August morning. I stood there by the lake as the water gently lapped against the wooden planking. I sat down on a bench and took in the view of Hyde Park and the famous Serpentine Lake. I turned and looked out across the park, out into the distance towards Kensington Palace. Kensington Palace, the home of the late, lamented Lady Di. So much had happened since her tragic death in 1997. In fact, the news of Posh and Beck's expensive engagement ring had broken on the Saturday in Manchester, so everything was set up for the Sunday papers to be full of pictures of Posh and Beck's. Instead, the tragic events in Paris changed everything. Some ducks were bobbing about on the lake. A few even waddled up to my bench in the hope of a few pieces of bread. I ignored my feathered friends, put my feet up on the bench and lay back in the morning sunshine. I just had to lie there and wait for a phone call from Posh. What a life. I closed my eyes and thought of Lady Di and how she was eternally pursued by the paparazzi. There were so many parallels between her life and Victoria's. They were both world famous. They both lived in palaces, well posh after a fashion. They were both endlessly fascinating to the British public and many people overseas. Diana had done so much dashing about, I thought. So many holidays, so many foreign trips and hectic car rides. She was estranged from the prince. She was living her own life, but somehow her endless dashing about was over the top. It was too much, and it all ended tragically. In so many ways. Since Lady Di's car crash, Posh had taken over Diana's role. She had moved up to be no one celeb in the UK. If the celebs score their popularity by the know of paparazzi who turn out for them, cameras flashing, then Victoria would win every time. She was endlessly pursued by the press and media. It was hectic, but Posh was level-headed. She knew how to cope with the pressure and all that attention. With her fashion sense and immaculate style, I often felt that she was almost performing for the media and paparazzi. She was so stylish, so well dressed, it was as if she looked upon them as her audience. She didn't want to disappoint her devoted audience, and she never did. It was around noon when my mobile rang. Of course it was Victoria. Would I pick her up at John Lewis's on Oxford Street? It goes without saying that she was loaded down with shopping. She had had a good morning and bought some presents for the boys, along with HP sauce and Coleman's mustard for David, plus lots of other culinary delights. Posh was in a good mood as we drove through London and up to Highgate Hill. She felt a sense of accomplishment. All the shopping was in the boot. She had lots of goodies to take back to Spain and some cool presents for the boys too. We picked up 2 hamburgers and French fries, then parked up to eat our midday meal. We ate it with our fingers, sat there looking through the windscreen at the scene before us, a panoramic view of the City of London. The view from Highgate Hill is one of the best views of London. You can see the vast city with its high-rise buildings, its office towers. You can see the River Thames. In fact, all of London is laid out before you like a huge map. Posh was feeling good after her 2 hours of shopping therapy. Now all she wanted was to relax and enjoy the rest of the day. "We used to come here as a family," she said, "and have a walk on Highgate Hill. It was great, even in winter with the cold wind blowing. What an amazing view." Victoria took off her headscarf and brushed her hair with her hand. Her hair was silky and natural. She looked lovely sitting there beside me, like a Spanish princess. She smiled impishly as she saw me looking at her, admiring her. But then she looked so smart in her blue jacket with the gold buttons, her black dress, and her sensible high heels. Then there was that perfume. What was it? The perfume she always seemed to wear. So subtle. It must be expensive, I thought. Later we went for a walk on Highgate Hill on that warm, summer's afternoon. A light breeze blew from the southeast as we walked along the pathway with tall grass on either side. There was the hum of bees. There were butterflies. It was the height of summer. Suddenly Posh took my arm as we walked along. I was a little shocked at first, but somehow it felt right. To any onlookers we must have appeared like young lovers out walking on a summer's day. "Who said, Posh? Your arm is all covered with blonde hair." It's true. My arms are hairy and I am naturally blonde, though I think of myself as having sandy hair. Blonde is somehow more for women. It was lovely to be up there on Highgate Hill, surveying London, with London at our feet. It was even nicer to have Posh Spice linking my arm and telling me little stories from her childhood, stories that so often involve her sister Louise and her brother Christian. I wanted to put my arm around her shoulder, but it would have been a little too forward. No. I was content to enjoy the warmth of a summer's day out there on Highgate Hill in the company of the lovely Posh Spice. We walked along a path, so overgrown with tall grass, and not far away we could see banks of purple willow herb. There was white meadowsweet in bloom too, its delicate white bloom scenting the warm, summer breeze. We sat down on a grassy bank to rest and enjoy the view of London. A view of office buildings and high-rise flats, blue and hazy in the afternoon heat. I steeled myself as we sat there together on the grass and put my arm around her shoulder. It felt so natural, my arm around her, a token of affection. We didn't speak, we just gazed out at the wonderful view. As we sat there, my mind went back to earlier events in the year. Already 2004 had seen the European Cup come and go. Alice England, after the nation's hopes had been raised so high, were unceremoniously kicked out of the competition by Portugal. Bex played a valiant part in the team, but in the end, even his footballing skills and experience couldn't save the team. To everyone's surprise, Greece won the European Cup, beating Portugal in the final. The European Cup tournament had come and gone. For Posh and David it was already ancient history. They were now looking forward, forward to David's exciting career at Real Madrid and their new life together in Spain. The spring of 2004 saw Rebecca loose revelations in the press, scandalous revelations of a torrid affair she had had with David Beckham. David denied the affair, of course, but Rebecca had given the press chapter and verse of their romance, and it was hard to see how she could have made up such intimate detail. I looked at Posh sitting beside me, so content and happy on a lovely summer's afternoon. I wondered what she thought of Rebecca loose and that sordid affair, of course. I didn't dare to ask. Two middle-aged ladies walked along the path, not far from where we were sitting. They had a little terrier dog on a lead. I smiled and waved at them. They waved back. To them we were just a young couple enjoying the August sunshine. They had no idea that I was sitting beside Posh Spice, one of the most famous women in the world. I squeezed her shoulder with my left hand as she ran her hand up and down my arm. The touch of Posh's hand was so affectionate. At that moment it really felt like we were lovers, sitting there together in the grass. The sun was warm. I could see butterflies flying above the purple willow herb. There was birdsong. There was the hum of bees. It was summertime in England and all the countryside was in bloom. Driving back to Buckingham Palace that afternoon, I felt that our relationship had changed. Posh was now openly affectionate towards me. We were touching. We were enjoying a hug, even an affectionate kiss. It was so nice to be on such familiar terms with the lovely Posh Spice. I couldn't believe my good fortune. However, things were different when we reached Buckingham Palace later that afternoon. Posh could never let her father, Tony, or her mother, Jackie, see her behave in such a way towards me. All of it was to be our little secret. I felt excited at our new intimacy and friendship. I was attracted to Posh in a big way and felt that she was attracted to me too. I began to wonder just how our relationship would develop, especially with our trip to the Lake District coming up so soon. Chapter 3 Thursday morning saw us heading up the motorway in the blue BMW. As we drove along, Posh told me that she had invited her sister Louise along for our weekend jaunt, but Louise was flying to Spain on Monday for a family holiday, so she couldn't make it. Posh didn't seem disappointed that it was just the two of us. She was happy to be out on the open road. She wanted to do a bit of sightseeing and just do some traveling in the countryside now the warm summer days were here. A hazy sun shone down as we raced north along the motorway, driving with the windows down to keep cool. So many of the fields were yellow with ripening corn, and there were fields of yellow rape. Yellow and gold seemed to be the colors of high summer. England's green and pleasant countryside looked so mellow and at peace. The world, by contrast, was anything but at peace. A cruel war raged in Iraq with atrocities occurring every single day. Earlier in the year, over 190 people had been killed on a train in Madrid, the result of a terrorist bomb. Posh never mentioned that terrible incident all the time I was with her. I think it was just too awful and painful for her to talk about. Yes, in 2004 there was no end to the tragic stories and disasters that plague the world. We read them in the newspapers every day. Meanwhile, over in Greece they were getting ready to stage the 2004 Olympic Games. The games were due to start on August 13th. I tried to get Posh chatting about the Olympics as we drove along, on that perfect summer's morning, but I don't think she was interested. Sport and athletics aren't really her thing. Not even football interests her that much, even though football is the lifeblood of her famous husband and his main interest in life. Posh tries to look interested when she goes to one of the football matches, but I'm sure she'd rather be at home, flicking through a magazine or watching some fashion show on TV. Posh reclined back in the luxurious leather seat beside me. She was wearing a close-fitting pink top that seemed to emphasize her lovely boobs. and white dress that stopped about 6 inches below her knee. She was casually dressed, stylish but casual, perfect for a summer's day. Posh wanted to make a stop in West Yorkshire and visit Haworth, the home of the famous Bronte sisters, so I had to leave the motorway and negotiate some unfamiliar roads. We drove through the old, industrial towns of Yorkshire, towns like Bingley and Keighley. We passed factories, mills and old canals dating back to the Industrial Revolution. Soon the road began to climb up into the Penny Hills, leaving the rows of terraced houses far behind. We were driving towards the high, moorland country, to the village of Haworth, a village built on the very edge of the moors. It was 11 o'clock when we finally parked in the spacious car park at Haworth. There were 3 or 4 coaches there, indicating that Haworth was something more than a run-of-the-mill penny village. Haworth is in fact a place of pilgrimage for lovers of the Bronte sisters and their wonderful novels and poems. Indeed, people go there from all over the world, drawn by the remarkable story of Patrick Bronte, a Church of England minister, and his remarkably gifted children, Charlotte, Emily, Branwell, and then we took a stroll around the village and walked up the main street with its cobblestones and quaint shops. So many of the houses in the village were built from local stone hewn from quarries high up on the moors. The village seemed to be from another century, from a Victorian age when respectable ladies dressed in bonnets and crinolines and traveled in horse-drawn carriages. I could see that Victoria was fascinated with the place as we walked up the steep cobbled street, my arm around her shoulder. Posh, like me, was thinking back to the 1820s and 1830s when Charlotte, Emily, and Branwell all lived together at the parsonage. It was fascinating to be in a place that had kept so much of its character and appearance from those far-off days. I'm sure that if the Bronte sisters came back, they would recognize the streets and houses, and so many places that were familiar to them all those years ago. The parsonage, we reached the church and decided to visit the Bronte Museum. At least, that was our plan, but the queue was much too long. We didn't have the patience to queue up for 2 hours or more. Having given up the Parsonage Museum, we went off to find a pub for a midday meal and a glass of something to drink. The Black Bull had been good enough for Branwell, so it was good enough for Posh and me. We sat in the lounge and ate our meal, a ham salad and chips. I insisted on the chips. A salad just wasn't enough to satisfy my ravenous hunger. The pub lounge was old world, each table with a red check tablecloth, and there were prints of local country scenes hanging on the walls. It was a pleasant place to have lunch, a place so full of history. It was of course in the Black Bull that Branwell used to carouse and astonish the locals and visitors with his eloquence and learning. It was from the Black Bull, too, that he would stagger home drunk each night. Hardly the appropriate behavior for the son of a Church of England clergyman. His drunken behavior and dissolute lifestyle began to make life a misery for Charlotte and her sisters, who witnessed his drunken rages and his growing addiction to opium. Almost inevitably his life ended in tragedy and he died at home at the young age of 31. "This village is the center of Brontland," said Posh, leaning back in her wooden chair and taking a sip of lager. "The shops are full of Bronte cakes, Bronte biscuits, Bronte fudge. Everyone's cashing in on the Bronte legend." "It's the same in Stratford-on-Avon," I said. "You can't blame the locals for trying to earn a penny from famous past residents, writers who are famous all over the world." "Yes," said Posh. I heard 1 or 2 American accents back there as we walked through the village. The afternoon was warm and fine. We were in no hurry to continue our journey to the Lake District. There was something about the village, perhaps its remote location and lack of traffic noise, but it felt so peaceful just being there. We were certainly in no hurry to leave. We walked past the church, and followed the track, upward, ever upward toward the moorland. The track, with stone walls on either side, gradually became rough and uneven, little more than a farm track. We stopped and looked out across the green fields with their dark stone walls and sheep grazing the rich pastures. There was a heat haze, the sun was partially obscured by high cloud. There were blackberry bushes at the side of the moorland track and willow herb. High on the moors there was catongras and purple heather. "Isn't it wonderful?" said Posh, stopping to brush the hair from her face and looking back in the direction of Haworth. "Isn't it amazing that they built a village up here on the very edge of the moors, knowing how bleak and wild it gets in the winter? They must have been hardy folk." We stood there looking at the roofs of the distant village, at the church tower. We'd come so far in such a short time. Now we were high up on the moors. The Bronte sisters must have walked along this same track thousands of times. They must have been familiar with every stone, every hawthorn tree, every farm along the way. Perhaps on some warm August day long ago, Charlotte, her housework done, walked up there alone, to collect her thoughts and dream up the plot for her next novel. We walked on, higher and higher until the track became merely a sheep path, winding its way through the heather and rough grass. We passed a sheepfold built of stone and then reached an old, abandoned cottage. The roof of the cottage had fallen in years ago and the slates were gone. I wondered who could have lived there, maybe a shepherd back in the days of Queen Victoria ? We walked through what was once the front gate. The stone gate posts were still there with the remains of the great stone wall. The house itself was a ruin, its walls overgrown with heather and rank weeds. "This is wonderful," said Posh, patting her manicured hand on the stone gate post. "Look, Stephen, you can just see Swarthy from here set amidst green fields stretching the distance. It must have been lonely living in this cottage," said Posh reflectively, "especially at night." Posh looked so lovely standing there in her pink, close-fitting top and her white dress, that showed off her slim, sexy legs. I put my arms around her waist and drew her toward me. We kissed, a long, lingering kiss. As we kissed I ran my hands up and down her back. I could feel her soft boobs pressing against me. Posh kissed my neck as I held her close and breathed in that wonderful perfume. What was that scent? Lily of the valley? Jasmine? At that moment I felt so relaxed and at peace. We were alone in that romantic place, high up on the moors, in the middle of nowhere. We had time on our hands, time for love and romance.